too poor to give them supplies.
Oh, God. We've been on this road now for 10 hours. We've had half a litre of water and 2 oranges each. I don't think we took the preparations for this leg of the trip as seriously as we should have done. But then I don't think Alexander the Great did either. In fact, coming this way makes me think it was a crazy notion to bring an army through here. The last big spring is 50 kilometers back. The Greeks, you can be sure, were in trouble before they even hit the sea.
At the sea, there was no sign of the fleet, only the boats of the fish-eaters. Alexander should have gone back now the way he'd come. But that wasn't his way. He decided to push on, sticking to the coast. Perhaps he was hoping to establish ports to link his empire. Perhaps he still hoped to meet the fleet. We don't know. From here, the only way to follow him was by camel.
Check this. An outsider will die on this route, yeah? Is that right?
An outsider will die.
God,
won't be able to find anyone.
Oh, great. That's extremely comforting to know. Is there water on the route? Are there actually spring water holes along the route, or do we have to carry the water?
He says that there is very few water springs.
Oh, that's great.
If I go, I can't find those.
We better take somebody with us who can. Then.
And so we left the burning shore by the great rock of Pasni, in the footsteps of Alexander's last epic march. The journey for Alexander's army soon became a nightmare.
Greeks came into an area of great hills of sand, and then Arrian says their feet sank in like treading into untrodden snow, and the horses and the mules just couldn't cope with that at all because they didn't have camels as we do. And sometimes Arrian says they had to go through the whole night without water, and in the morning they'd be leaving people behind who were sick or ill or just too tired or absolutely dying of thirst. And of course, those people were never seen again. They were lost, says Arrian, like people fallen overboard and lost at sea.
Now, for the first time in his life, he was staring at defeat.
Why did he come here to the Makran? I just don't know. He was trying to get back to Iran, I guess. But why he came here to this coast, I don't understand. I don't understand.
Alexander became greatly distressed because they were travelling through such awful terrain, says the geographer Strabo. According to one source, only a quarter of the army survived. The truth will never be known, but even though he was in such desperate straits, Alexander still showed flashes of his old self.
Alexander was leading the army on foot, as he often did, to encourage the troops. and everybody was absolutely desperate for thirst. And some soldiers found a tiny bit of water in a dried up stream bed and brought it to him just in a helmet. And in front of the whole army, he poured it away into the sand. If they couldn't drink, then he wouldn't. The Greeks always cited this story as being proof of his noble character. Personally, I find it a little frightening that after all that he'd put them through, they could still be won over by his tricks.
But the truth is, they still loved him and still needed his leadership to pull them through. And he still needed them in order to be Alexander.
Out here you really do wonder why on earth he brought his army through this appalling wilderness. Almost makes you wonder whether he wanted to punish them for what happened at the Bias River, for not following him to the ends of the earth. But among the Greeks, the most popular explanation was this: simply that it was there. He'd been told the journey was impossible for an army, and because of his inner demon, he just had to do it. He had to excel everybody. He had to do what nobody else had done.
And of course, in the past, his gambles had always paid off. It took him 60 days to get through the Makran. In the spring, he arrived back in Persepolis, from where he'd set off east 7 years before. He walked through the burned palace of the Persian kings, destroyed at his orders. And with hindsight, he regretted what he'd done. After all, he was the king now. He was now wearing the robes and tiara of the Persian Shah. He could no longer be a mere conqueror, a seeker after glory. Now he had to rule the biggest empire the world had ever seen. And Iran was now the center of his universe. He still had great plans, among them to conquer the West. But fate, or the will of the gods, was closing in. There, suddenly, after a massive binge, his dearest friend and lover, Hephaestion, died. Alexander was almost suicidal in his grief. "Others loved me because I was king," he said. "Hephaestion loved me for myself." The bazaars were rife with rumour. Some spoke of poison, that the king too did not have long to live, that the omens were against him, that he'd lost his sense of purpose. The legend is still told by the traditional tale-tellers in Iran.
تمام دنیا زیر نگین اسکندر آمد. اما یه رو اسکندر اومد جلوی آینه هم چی کنه؟ دید موها سپید. یه روز اسکندر دید حالش داره منقلب میشه.
That last spring, he moved back into Iraq. Now, obsessed with every omen, the king dithered while his soothsayers argued over the flight of birds. The signs, they said, were plain. He must not enter Babylon. Till now he'd never ignored the gods, but now he did. By the banks of the Euphrates, after another heavy drinking session, the king fell ill. The wounds, alcohol, grief had finally taken their toll. Imagine the claustrophobia of the palace, the hanging gardens with their forest of palms, the somnolent heat of the river. There's a diary of those last days. It's one of the most dramatic records in history. This is the account of the king's last days. It comes almost word for word from the royal diaries. On the 29th of May, he slept in the bathroom because he was feverish. He spent the next day playing dice. 31st, he bathed and lay down in the bathroom, listening to Nearchus tell the story of the return of the fleet from India. On the 1st of June, the fever grew more intense. He had a bad night, and all through the next day, his fever was very high. 5th of June, they moved him to the other side of the river. There he slept a little, but the fever did not abate. The Macedonian veterans now believed he was dead and pushed their way into the palace to see him a last time. The motive in almost every heart was grief and a sort of helpless bewilderment at the thought of losing him. Lying speechless as the men filed by, he still struggled to raise his head, and with his eyes gave a look of recognition to each individual as he went past. On the 10th of June, towards evening, he died.
O Μέγας Αλέξανδρος, όλον τον κόσμο κέρδισε και την ψυχή του έχασε.
After 20,000 miles, our journey was over. It ended where it began, in the shadow of Mount Olympus, the home of the gods. Alexander's search for eternal glory was cut short, and ever since he's carried the weight of an unfulfilled destiny, the hero who flew too close to the sun and whose wings were burned. But today the verdict of history is harsher. A man broken in the end by the loneliness and insanity of absolute power. Is that how we should see Alexander's career now? As a self-destructive madness rather than everlasting glory? I'll tell you what I think, for what it's worth, having followed in his footsteps for this far. And that is that all the evils unleashed by men of war in our own time teach us that we should reject Alexander's ideals. But Alexander was a man of his time, not of ours. He believed in the gods, and he would have accepted their verdicts, both for good and ill. If he could answer us here now, I'm sure he would say, like the tragic hero that he is, "Let the gods be my judges, for in every sign that they gave me, they told me no lies."
Μέγας Αλέξανδρος.